I'm in a little bedroom in a new apartment we got in Santa Monica, California. And this is going to be my writing room someday. Now it's just a little bedroom where I go to do Zoom.
So I had no idea that you were now in Los Angeles. This is a permanent move?
Yeah, we got a little apartment because our daughters live here. And also because the last 15 years we've been living out in the woods, and we kind of have forgotten to do basic things like how to order coffee at a restaurant and stuff. So we're upgrading to a higher level of sociability. Okay. So we're going to split time between here and Corralitos, California.
Where's Corralitos?
It's outside of Santa Cruz.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
and I still commute back to Syracuse in the fall to teach. So it's a pretty, it's a pretty peripatetic lifestyle.
There you go. Yeah, you're bi-coastal, right, as they say.
Yeah.
Well, you are now celebrating the publication of your first story collection in a while, almost 10 years?
Yeah. 10th of December was the last.
I'm wondering, with regard to the fanfare that greets the publication of your books nowadays versus earlier in your career when there was considerably less, I'm wondering, with all the interviews that you do, all the press attention that your book gets, do you like that part of it? Is this a part of the process that you enjoy, or is this something that you sort of grit your teeth and get through?
No, I really enjoy it, and maybe a little too much. It's sort of for me, it's a kind of a way to celebrate at the end and get to talk to people who are interested in it and who are interested in their own right. So I figure it's just all good, And then also at this stage of my life, I really like to challenge myself a little. So the pace of from now until like whatever, November, December, it's a really intense pace, and I kind of like to just see if I can do it, do the travel, and if I can sort of stay sharp. And, you on tour, you're always getting kind of curveballs. So I like that feeling of going, okay, could I stay alert at all time, at most times anyway, give decent answers, be present. So to me, it's pretty fun. And the only bad part is that sometimes, for my taste, it goes a little too long, and I'm kind of anxious to get back to work. But no, I try to really just conceptualize it as an incredible opportunity, really, Yeah,
well, I like this idea of it being an exercise in trying to maintain your alertness and attention.
Yeah, because it goes. If I talk too long, I just start talking. There's no delay between the thought and the speaking. So that's a real discipline to try to keep that reined in a little bit and make sense.
Well, as I was reading your book and thinking about this conversation and jotting down notes and preparing, what I was thinking to myself is George has done at this stage 1 million of these things. And so the challenge that I presented to myself was to try to throw you a curveball, or at least make this both maximally useful to you and to listeners, but also hopefully to do something that you haven't quite done. And I might fail. You might be like, I've done this 17 times already.
So it's a whole interview about motocross racing.
That is what it's going to be. And also cooking. I'm going to have you
God.
cook.
Oh, my God.
But no, I thought what we would do is take a tour and take listeners through a real tour of Liberation Day, story by story. And the way that I'm going to frame it up is that I am going to introduce the story. I will give a thumbnail of what I think it's about, and then you can correct me in all the ways that I'm wrong, or add or subtract or whatever. And then another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to then kind of take over and talk about the creative point of origin for each story, if you can locate it. I know these things happen sort of intuitively and in the big jumble of sitting at the keyboard, but there are such great flights of imagination in your work that it causes it causes me to go, God, where is he getting this from? What is George reading? What is George watching? What was it that he saw out in the world that got him moving down this path?
Oh, that sounds like a great approach. That's wonderful. Yeah, let's do that.
And then the second part will be, in addition to creative point of origin, will be big questions, because this conversation follows one that we had after you published your craft book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, and we talked a lot about craft there. And one of the things that I recall you talking about with regard to the Russian authors, the great Russian authors of yore, which figure greatly into that book, is that they're not afraid to walk right up to the big questions. And so this is something that I think you aspire to in your work. So I'd love to have you talk about the big questions that you were kind of playing with in each story. So that will be the framework for the tour. And we're going to begin with the title story of the collection, Liberation Day, which, to give a thumbnail, is kind of it's like a speculative, futuristic, eerie, kind of sci-fi story. There are workers known as speakers and workers known as singers who are indentured to entertain a wealthy family. And I kind of envision these people as AI. They're almost reduced to code or some sort of machine-like existence. And I'm just wondering where you begin. Like, where did this begin for you?
Yeah. And by the way, that's a great thumbnail. I wish I might have to plagiarize it, because I've tried to explain that and I just go around and around in circles and nobody would want to read it, but thanks for that. Yeah. So, okay. So in terms of origin, if I'm being really honest, the way it works for me is I'm just thinking, okay, time for a new story. Then I'm kind of saying, what do you feel like doing in your chest? Like, sort of like, what voice do you feel like doing? Just really being, like fun seeking with that. So with this one, I think I had just finished the second, what turns out to be the second story in the book, The Mom of Bold Action, which is sort of clipped in its tone. It's kind of very realistic and matter of fact. And I was just kind of wanting to push off away from that and do something a little wilder with the voice. Okay. So that was one part of the motivation. I'd been working on a screenplay for a story of mine called The Simple Girl Diaries, which was in 10th of December. And that's got a kind of a similar thing where in that story, these women, from what we understand to be poor countries, are hung in this guy's backyard for like lawn ornaments. And so from writing in the screenplay, there was just a little bit of overflow from that idea. And then the third thing was from that Russian book, I'd been writing, I think, about Turgenev and his song, The Singers. So just that phrase, The Singers, was in my head. So those things were floating around, and I just said, okay, let me start something. And that's the part I don't actually understand, is I don't really exactly see how those three things make the first couple pages of the story, but they did. Mostly it's a fun-seeking riff. I'm looking for a riff, and I don't care what it's about. I don't care what the themes are. I just want to be able to make a voice and then pursue it a little bit. So that's where the basic setup came. Although that early, I didn't really know who was speaking or why or anything like that. So that's the part that's really hard to talk about, is it is sort of just sheer playfulness. And if I can get into the mode of sheer playfulness, I know that something will come out that will then get more serious, So that
okay, so here's a question, because Liberation Day, like other stories in this collection, not all of them, like you mentioned, The Mom of Bold Action is more like realistic. So as a writer, as I'm kind of reading these stories, that's when I can imagine myself theoretically having easier access to, because it's a world that I know. But Liberation Day, with these AIs or these speakers or these singers and this entire world that you've built, is a real flight of the imagination. And the only way that any story works is if it has an internal logic to it that holds. But to build the internal logic of a story that is this imaginative and that has this specific of a voice, because you talk about the music of the voice and trying to kind of feel what you wanted to hear or what you wanted to speak on the page. It's very unique. And I'm wondering how do you get there to where you feel like the rules of the story are being adhered to so that the world holds together?
Yeah, for me, it's the revision process is you're doing two things. One, you're trying to get those rules to reveal themselves, and the way they do is that the prose will suddenly be good in a certain place, and you're like, okay, then you're in the story. And therefore, I have to stick to whatever rules you've just told me about. So for example, you're writing along, and in this story, at one point, I used the word pinioned. I am pinioned to this wall. And it sounded cool, because it's a sort of a weird register. He'll be talking pretty casually, and then he'll suddenly use this strange diction. So I said, okay, pinioned, you're in the story as a word. well, then it means that they're pinioned, so that's a rule. You can't forget the whole rest of the story that their baseline is somehow attached to this wall. So revision is a process of doing that. And at the same time, you're kind of aware that you bit off a pretty weird concept, it's even just hearing it described is like, what? It's crazy. So then the revision is also based on me imagining you over there reading it and trying to imagine your resistances at certain points. Like at some point, is this thing so crazy that you're going to bail? If so, I better run up and beat you to the past there and give you something to hold on to. So in a sense, that's what world building is I'm anticipating the places where you feel that this is just indulgent, or crazy for the sake of being crazy. And I'm going like, no, Brad, it isn't, because let me tell you something. And I give you a little more information, and then you're like, well, okay, so it's starting to make sense to me. So these questions you're asking, for me, that's completely what the revision process is, is anticipating those resistances, and also seeing it as a way to discover the rules of the world and then swear to adhere to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And like a phrase that kept occurring to me, especially when I was reading these more speculative stories of yours, is deep dream. I was just like, wow, this is like a really deep dream. It must require like a lot of concentration. It requires some concentration of me as a reader, because it's one of those stories that sort of teaches you how to read it as you go. And that's part of the thrill, is once you get it, you're like, okay, now I get it. I'm on board with this voice, and I kind of understand the rules of this world.
No, and that's exactly right. That's what revision is kind of. Exactly what you said. You're teaching the reader to read your story, but of course you're also teaching yourself along the way. You're not sure yourself.
Does it require more concentration of you, more labor to write a story like Liberation Day than it does to write a story that operates in a more realistic mode?
No, it doesn't. Because really, even the ones that seem to be more realistic, they're actually not when you look at them. It's almost like, how do I say it? If you were going to dress in a really insane costume and you were going to dress in regular clothes, it's basically the same effort. You still have to make sure it's, on right and fits and so on. So for me, it's not really more concentration. It's sometimes, no, actually, once I give myself the weird nugget to start with, it's pretty much the same procedure. Let me go through it, improve it line by line, make it more believable. In something like Liberation Day, the work is a little bit more high wire, because it's possible that the idea is too crazy to finish. It's possible, So you might find yourself cornered and like, well, I don't know how to get out of this. So there is that. But basically, it's just, it's just going through it again and again and again. And in this story, part of what I'm trying to do with those iterations is to smooth out the places where you might feel disbelief. That's really, but again, it's the same in a realistic story. I think so. Yeah.
So in terms of big questions with Liberation Day, to kind of carry on the tradition of your Russian heroes, the questions, I jotted down some questions that I thought you were addressing in the story, and feel free to add, subtract. But one of them was, what is entertainment? The ways in which human beings entertain ourselves in this world can sometimes be questionable. And certainly in this story, it's a bit of an odd one. And also the relationship that we have, like how is our relationship with technology affecting our humanity?
Yeah, those are good ones. Yeah.
Were those things you were thinking about? Are there others?
I mean, the honest truth is it's for me that the order is, I know we've talked about this, but the order is a little reverse, where I'm not really sure what I want to talk about until I've already talked about it. Because with the way mine works, if I know what it is, I've got a really conventional, like, current event mind. I don't have anything original to say about politics or culture, really. So if I started with something I wanted to say about technology, I'd say that thing and you go, yeah, I've heard that before. So for me, it's more like, lead with the events and the action and the drama. And then at some point, of course, you are talking about things. But hopefully it's a suite of things, and hopefully it's not reducible to something at the end, So when I think about the big questions in this story, one, they were revealed to me. I didn't plan it. And second of all, it's sort of about, okay, how to say it? The big idea has to do with the process the reader goes through as she follows me. So on this story, my experience going through it was I kept having trouble knowing who to root for. You know, every time I'd situate somebody as a hero, I'd kind of undercut it a little bit. Or every time emotionally you were thinking, oh, I'm for this person, something in the story, you know. So for example, in the story, there's a kind of a planned liberation of these people by this really unlikable guy, you know. So you're like, well, I don't like you. I've been told by the story not to like you. And yet you seem to be doing the thing I would do. And then he messes it up and it turns into fiasco. So this was from the Russians, that idea that we're always trying to pick a hero in a story. And I think good stories tend to complicate that a bit, you know. And so they become meditations on our own you know. So I'm rooting for the main character in the story, Jeremy, because I'm in his head and he seems like a nice guy, you know. So I'm rooting for him. But then I start to notice that some of his ideas are fucked up. Like he doesn't really understand his own situation. So I pull away from him a little bit. So I think that's where, for me, the big idea of this is about the kind of tenuousness of our habitual allegiances, especially in a political time like ours where we know which side we're on. But real life makes a lot of complications at the edges. So I kind of felt inadvertently that I'd kind of stumbled onto that in this one.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The big questions that we're talking about, I think you could possibly call that theme. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fairly common for writers to discover their themes sort of after the fact rather than to begin with them.
Yeah.
Though I read like a writer like Vonnegut, he always comes to mind when I think about this issue is he seems to start with the big question. I could be totally wrong. Maybe he arrives at it the same way that you do, but I get the idea that you write it and then you finish it and then you realize what you were concerned with. Yeah.
Or even, sometimes, like with this book, starting to talk about it now, it's only occurring to me what the stories are about now, you know. But the idea is as someone who's good at revision, you're just increasing you're increasing the intensity of everything in the whole deal, including by the order of the stories. You don't know, I don't know that I could really articulate what I mean by that, but I feel it. Like, okay, it's getting better, it's getting better. Then at the end, when you really feel like you've done everything you can, you pronounce it done. And then the story starts saying, did you know that I mean this? Like, oh, that's okay. That's good. But I also think it's important to say that, who knows? I mean, like every method can work. And that's, the kind of the pisser about being a writer is you have these nice outbursts of craft talk, but they might have nothing to do with you. A writer might say, no. I start with every section outlined and it works for me. Then, okay, that's it,
Yeah. No, I just talked to Elizabeth Strout, and she writes in scenes. She writes entire novels just in like these bursts and then just stitches them together after the fact. She has no grander sense.
And they're like, great novels.
Right. It works.
But do you get the sense when she had those separate scenes, does she know what one is leading to, or is she just writing the scenes and then inferring a causality from the way they speak to her, or how to?
I think it's like the way that she described it to me is that they have to have a pulse, first of all. She has to feel like, a real heartbeat in each of these little scenes. And I think sometimes she writes them as standalones. Other times I have to imagine she knows where they will stitch together. Yeah. But then other times in the revision, she'll realize, like I want to say she said she wrote the end of Olive Kittredge very early in the process and sort of hung on to it and then realized, it fit at the end, kind of like a puzzle piece. But, it's just interesting how everybody, there's all these different ways of skinning the cat. And if it works, it works.
Yeah. We might have talked about this last time, but there was a movie producer named Stuart Kornfeld that I knew. And he had this idea that in a movie script anyway, every scene had to do two things. It had to be entertaining in its own right. So that spark or that whatever you just use for, and then it also has to move the story ahead in a non-trivial way. So I mean, that's a little bit rulish, but at the same time, it's kind of interesting. If you have a scene that is really funny, wouldn't it be cool if it was funny and it changed the essential direction of the story, So I always have that in my mind a little bit, like looking at a scene and going, okay, you're funny. I would really love it if you could make something happen, in addition to being funny. Or if a scene is really functional, you're like, you're really doing a lot of work for the story. Could you be a little more charming? and that way you kind of get a 2-for-1.
Wait, did Stewart work for Ben Stiller?
Yeah.
Or with Ben Stiller? Okay, I just talked to Jerry Stahl on this show, and I want to say dedicated his book to Stewart. He was a buddy of his as well.
Stewart just passed away, and he's a great guy, funny guy, and just a real, he had worked early in his career with Mel Brooks. So you can imagine working I don't know if he's an assistant, but Mel Brooks all the way up to a couple of years ago. So he knew everybody, and he had a great, lovely nature, funny, acerbic sometimes, and really just sweet as anything other times. And
did you work on something with him, like a screenplay project? Or?
Yeah, well, Ben and I have this long history with my story, CivilWarLand and Bad Decline. We've been trying to get it made since '98, I think, and it's come close a couple of times. So Stewart was involved with all that, and it's funny because it never got made, but I just treasure those times. We'd all be together trying to get it to work, and he was a real deal.
Well, I'm going to just, in the interest of time, because, we've got, 10 stories in this collection?
Yeah,
I forget the exact number. But we've got to make sure we get through. So I want to move to The Mom of Bold Action.
No comment.
Which...
There, that way.
But I got to say, I just right away you had me with the title. I love this title. And this story is about a frustrated writer and a housewife who is facing turmoil when her young son is attacked in their small town. And he is attacked. This is where the kind of the funhouse aspect of the story comes into play. He is attacked by one of two identical old creeps. I think. I mean, there's nothing, there's some confusion about which old creep that pushed her son down and physically assaulted him, essentially. So feel free to add, subtract. But I would love to know the creative point of origin. Like, was there one that you can locate?
Yeah, this one's easy, and it's a little bit. I always wonder if this is a good thing to confess, but I, since I'm sure there are writers listening, I'll just do it. That first 2 or 3 pages of the story fell off of another one from years ago, and it was a scene that wasn't needed in that story. It was funny, there's a funny riff in there, but kind of to what we were just talking about. It was funny, but it didn't do any work to advance it. The story was 10th of December. So this woman was originally the mother of that kid. And in the story, it was a scene it was funny. It totally slowed the whole thing down at a moment when it should have been speeding up. And when you stepped away from it, it didn't do any work. It just was funny. So I would, with some regret, popped it out of that story, put it aside. And then a few years ago, I was just going through these old files of similar chunks that have fallen off of other things. Thought the jokes were kind of funny and didn't have anything else going on. So my theory is if something has a spark, if it has something going for it and you kind of free it from its original incorrect matrix, then it'll start kind of stretching its arms a little bit and going, oh, thank goodness I'm out of that story I didn't belong in. And so that I just dropped it into a file and started messing with it. And then at the point where, she's waiting for her son to come home. So I just had to think up a reason for her son to be late, and I was kind of like tired of, I always get heat out of my stories by making animals or kids, putting them in peril. And I'm like, I'm tired of that. So I just made it a little, he gets shoved down by an old hippie,
Right,
who hasn't that happened to? I mean, it's like every day. So then it was off to the races. Just, once I got the voice going, now she's got a job, she's a writer. And then it went actually for me pretty quickly after that, partly because it is in that kind of pared down voice where it said early on that it's not going to be very wasteful. It's going to be pretty quick,
It's a funny story. Like all your stories, like I love these people. And the question that I found myself asking, like when I was trying to think about what you were pondering in this one, is kind of a fundamental question about the difference between right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are we supposed to respond when evil is done to us or bad things happen to us? And what is the meaning of justice?
Yeah.
Because there is a kind of vigilante, funny, sort of almost suburban feeling, domestic vigilante justice in this story. But that's the canvas that you're working on, right?
There was a moment where, so the kid had been pushed down and they caught the guy. And at that point, my heart dropped a little because I'm like, oh God, this is like CSI. Now we have to go to court and I don't know. So there was just one of those weird, inexplicable moments where I thought, oh, they catch a second guy who looks just like him. And as soon as I had that, I got so happy because I didn't exactly know how to solve that one, but it felt funny. It felt like, oh yeah. And, so it was justice, but it was also the way that, well, two things. She makes a small mistake and the whole thing goes in the shitter, And I thought that's something I've noticed about life is the system of punishment is not really, in proportion to the crime often. You do some little thing, you don't pay attention for a second and you get in a car accident and somebody gets hurt, or, you say something offhandedly and years later you found out it was really hurtful. So that was something I was thinking about. And then the other part for me was just like, I have this really active mind, monkey mind, I would say, so I kind of gave that to her, and I really enjoyed watching her worry play out and her attempts to forgive herself and her attempts to justify what she had done. And yeah.
And also her attempts creatively to find a story in the minutia of her day-to-day life, because she is a writer, right? And she's constantly thinking of she looks at anything and starts to make a story out of it, and that becomes really fun.
Right. And also for her, I definitely found some of myself in her, because when she thinks of a story, she's basically saying, would this be guaranteed to work? And then she quickly concludes, oh no, that's stupid. And then she throws it away. So she's not a real reviser, apparently. And, so she's got a kind of a controlling mind where she wants to know it'll work before she does it. And I think that carries over into real life too. She wants to control the situation with her son, and she does a couple slightly manipulative things. So I'm just really interested in the cause and effect of something like this, where you start with a small incident where she was wronged, and then because her response is a little disproportionate, the karma kind of exaggerates, and then finally at the end of it, she's in I feel really bad for her at the end of the story. She's in a pretty rough place, And at the end, she does something that, when I first wrote it, I thought, oh, good for you. That was very noble of you. And then a few weeks later, I was rereading it. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's a little iffy what she did. She withheld certain information from her husband to protect him. But there was like a second wave of thought, like, oh yeah, actually, maybe that's not so good. Maybe she's enabling him in some way, So that kind of story is fun when I came to believe in it enough that it was like people to me. It wasn't just something I made up. It was, people in the world.
Well, the cause and effect issue is I think that's another part of the big question, or the spectrum of big questions that this story is dealing with. And I actually, when I was prepping for this, read an interview that you did. I want to say it was with the Harvard Crimson, something to do with Harvard, but it was a great interview. I was reading it, and I think you talked about cause and effect in a way that really moved me. But this is an issue that's of interest to me. Cause and effect, is it real, or is chance, dictating the way things unfold in the world? And is everything I do and say and think, has it determined where I am today? Is it my fault? Or what about the child in Ukraine who's caught up in this war? What did they do? Cause and effect. Right. I guess it's their parents. How do you make sense? Do you make sense? Have you arrived at some sort of point of understanding with respect to this? Not really, but
I think cause and effect means, I think what I do is I kind of decouple cause and effect from blame or credit. So cause and effect just means, if you could be God, and you would see that every time a sparrow falls, that's really true. Of course, because scientifically, of course it is. Everything, has a ripple effect. And so the world at this moment is the sum total of all the ripples that came before. It's almost like circular, of course. But then when you put an individual consciousness into it, it gets interesting, because we aren't God and we can't anticipate that something we did 4 years ago had a bad effect or a good effect. We don't have that kind of clarity and that kind of information. So I think I totally believe it's cause and effect. I don't actually believe in chance, but I think things look like chance. Since we have that partial knowledge, it looks like an accident. But of course, if you could know all of it, it wouldn't be. But in the story, I think, I don't know about that. I think cause and effect is one of the things that a story trains us to look for in it. So if something does happen by chance in a story, I always think, well, it's got to cause something, So a tree branch falls on a character. That's not, that isn't his fault. But once it falls on him, then he has to react, and the meaning of the story comes from his reaction to that. So that's how I understand it anyway. And of course, all this stuff is each of us understands the mechanics of a story differently and believes in certain things and then acts on that to make stories that adhere to that dogma, and hopefully they work, But I think, I'm a little rule leery at this point, having written that Russian book and talked about it and stuff. I'm like, I don't really believe in rules, I believe there are tendencies, but I don't really, basically my philosophy with my students and everything is just do what you want. Do what you want, right, and do it emphatically enough that I love it, and then that's good.
There you go. So Love Letter is the next story, and this is an epistolary story written in the hand of a grandfather who is concerned about his grandson, writing to his grandson tenderly, lovingly, in a dystopian political situation in what feels like the not too distant future. This is an unsettling story in that sense, and it feels uncomfortably possible, based on recent, the recent political climate here in the States in particular, but also elsewhere. So, I'm wondering about creative point of origin. I can imagine it, but maybe there was something more specific you could point to.
Yeah, it was just, I'd had two arguments/discussions with people that I love. One was with a person to the right of me, and one was a person to the left of me. And they were fun, and they were kind of, on the edge of not fun. They were a little bit, just before the 2020 election. And so they were kind of, and I just thought afterwards, most of my time I'm in my house thinking, and nobody's objecting to me. My ideas are all perfect, and my arguments are cogent, and then once you get out in the world, you start messing up and misunderstanding and, saying things you don't exactly mean. And most excitingly of all, you start doubting your own certainties. Somebody who you disagree with will say something and you'll go, shit. Oh, maybe, So I was thinking about that and how actually that's a very lively thing to do, a really important thing to do. It's love in a sense. If you love the person, then that's a way of pushing it, into real love, because they love you in spite of, and they love you because of, and, so I just thought I'm going to try to write down something like that, mostly as a way to vent about my anxiety about the upcoming election. That was really it. So originally the guy was me, exactly me, talking to an imaginary grandson about 10 years from now. And, and but even as I was doing that, I'm like, okay, you, grandfather, have to distinguish yourself from me, because this can't just be my thoughts. And so he started to come out on the page a little more, I would say, cautious than I am. A little more careful. He's telling his grandson to not get in trouble with this new authoritarian regime. So he became a character, and he became kind of like that representative part of each of us that, in a crunch, maybe puts their head down a little bit, So that was really it. And then basically when I'm doing that, I'm always looking for some kind of change within the story. So if he starts out being a cautious person, urging his grandson to be careful, I kind of want to rattle his cage a little bit. And I think at the end of that story, in my reading of it, he is slightly less sure of himself than at the beginning. And he even offers his grandson a little money if the grandson does want to become a little rebellious, So I don't know. But mostly, it was like I want to do an experiment. Could I take these really lively, very current political feelings I was having and use them to write a story? That was just an experiment, really.
It's funny that you talk about thinking of this or conceiving of it originally as like a letter to a potential future grandchild, because I'm working on a book about that election season, the last 4 months of that season. And I've been kind of feeling my way through it. And one of the bits that I've been doing is a letter to a potential future grandchild, because it's a natural thing to do. I feel like, wow, what would you say to them if things go south? Or how would you even explain this time if they asked you about it? We have been living through some pretty extraordinary history.
Yeah, what a valuable thing if your grandfather was in Germany in 1939 and he wrote you a letter about it, That would be really useful. The closest thing to that is there's a book called I Will Bear Witness by Victor Klemperer, and he was a Jewish professor in Dresden in all those years. And he writes a diary that mostly is just, I have a headache today. I'm learning to drive a car. We're getting the roof done. Oh, and tonight Hitler was on the radio, and what a silly guy, And then, so his attention is never on politics. He doesn't know, of course, what's happening exactly. And so day by day, you just see the Holocaust happening kind of in color. It's a shocking, quiet but shocking book.
Oh, I'll have to read that one. That sounds, that speaks to what I think it is like for all of us as ordinary citizens living through extraordinary times. And then you factor the pandemic into that as well. So much of it is just domestic, mundane, ordinary. You can't possibly live your life at a fever pitch, ratcheted up, full of cortisone and watching cable news, at all times. So much of it is just like, I'm just getting the car washed and, looking out the window.
I was thinking too that, a lot of it for me is to try to do whatever it is during the day that makes me feel a little more functional and happy, so that if and when I have to make a decision, I'm more there, So for me, that's writing. And I have mixed feelings because, you're in the middle of all this, you go to your writing shed and it's really cool up there and you have your fun, and then, but I feel like during that time I didn't do any harm anyway. And when I come down, my mind is a little more something, a little sharper, a little more generous, and not so discouraged, which I think is probably a pretty big deal,
And the questions that I came away with from Love Letter: how best to respond to fascism? Is it worth surviving in a brutal and corrupt system by becoming complicit with it, even if you know it's wrong? These are the tough questions that I think extreme political circumstances can ask of us. And really maybe any political circumstance. Like, what is my moral obligation as a citizen might be another question. And I think that's what this grandfather is wrestling with.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, And the other thing that came into my mind is just that, it's funny, especially when one goes into interview mode, as I am at the moment, you kind of can convince yourself that your job is to have an answer at every moment for everything, and when I'm writing this guy, I'm like, oh yeah, so he basically didn't have a good answer at the time. He didn't maybe have any options at the time. He kind of makes that case that a guy like him, he's working full time, he's got dental problems, he's not a powerful guy. And then now, as he's talking to his grandson, he doesn't have a lot of options. He did what he did. So I think I was thinking a bit about how, for all of our good intentions and for all of our internal narratives that tell us that we have an answer for everything, most of our life, we're in a state where we actually don't have any answers, and we're just praying that some bad shit doesn't happen to us to demonstrate that to us, But mostly we're in a state where our current views are probably not exactly right. Our current actions are not as virtuous as we think they are. And every so often the world will swing around and whack us in the head and prove that to us. So it's kind of like the whole book to me is a little bit like this. As I was writing it, it sort of made me feel a bit of enforced humility, like, oh man, we are very much at the whim of the world. We really are. And that's it, And so, of course, because we know that, we kind of construct ideologies and craft talks and, all this stuff. And at the end of each one of those, the moral is always, but it's okay. But as we're kind of finding out, maybe, in certain times it was not okay. And people died with that on their lips. I was wrong.
Right.
It's
right.
true. Yeah.
Well, and also just like these circumstances that life will present us sometimes where there really aren't any great options.
Right.
That happens a lot too. And I think we can trick ourselves, or I can trick myself into thinking like there's a right answer here. There's a way out, or there's a way in that I'm just not seeing. And but sometimes in life it's trickier than that and more difficult.
And I think the other thing in the whole book that I had in mind, or sort of wrote myself into having in mind, is just the idea that the reason that's so painful is because we harden around this idea of ourself as being the star of the show, the smartest person, the person in control, the person that's going to live forever, the person who never makes a mistake. We construct that for ourselves, and it's all false, or it's temporary, it's kind of conditional. And then every so often the world goes, well, yeah, I know that you're Brad, but also a tree limb is falling on your head. sorry, and at that moment you're kind of offended because I'm Brad, I'm George, I'm Brad. This shouldn't happen to me. Or maybe more dramatically, you make a mistake. You drop a tree limb on somebody's head. That doesn't fit with my idea of myself as a person mindful and cool and in control of everything. But of course it happens all the time. But that's the moment when this, the fiction of the permanent, wonderful self gets punctured by reality, and that's always waiting to happen. And if we're lucky, it doesn't happen today. And, we can kind of, so I think a lot of times in the book, there are places where someone finds out that their self and their love of self is causing them some trouble.
Speaking of which, I will take us to the next story, which is called A Thing at Work, which is about an escalating office dispute that disrupts multiple lives, like both in and out of the office. And it's a funny story too. There's something great about your grasp of the absurdities of the workplace and of corporate capitalism and the demands that it places on us, moral and otherwise. But also just the minutia of it, like the break room and the coffee and the supplies and all this stuff, that it really does a great job of rendering all of that. And I'm wondering, again, like point of origin, is there something you can recall that got you started on this one?
Yeah, years ago, I worked as a tech writer at this company in upstate New York, and there was a really nice woman who worked with us. And the only thing I took from her was that at one point she left. She vanished from the workplace for about 2 months, and then when she came back, she kind of sheepishly said she'd been in jail because she had bounced some checks. And such a sweet person, great worker, and we just said okay, and that we went on, So I just always thought that little detail of somebody who, was coming into this somewhat, it was a pretty nice corporate environment, not great, but it was okay, and working alongside everybody very cheerfully. But meanwhile, her life is hard enough that she's bouncing checks on purpose. She was, so that detail stuck with me. So I just took that one detail and left her, the real person, behind. And just about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I just started riffing on the idea of somebody who does that. And the story had taken a lot of different directions. And then about 3 years ago, I brought it back to focus on her, with her as kind of the linchpin and a couple of other people. And so the process was kind of starting with her, and at that moment, she's also stealing from work a little bit. After she gets out of jail, she just does some minor theft.
It's like paper towels.
Yeah,
it's like these little items. She's not stealing like huge fistfuls of cash or anything. But
coffee bags and
things like that, like little pounds of flesh or whatever for her labor. And she does, she's sort of like doing the thankless work of the office,
right?
And not getting paid a ton and all the rest. But the questions that this brought up for me. This is definitely a story that's about power. It's interesting in this like kind of microcosmic environment of the office. You mentioned the main character. Is her name Gloria?
Brenda, I think.
Brenda. Sorry. And you have Brenda, and then you have these other. It's like Tim, and there's
Jen.
another Tim and Jen. There we go. And they are more powerful than she is. Tim is the head honcho. Jen is maybe the one who is best at pulling the levers of power, or operating, as I would put it. Some people just know how to operate in these systems, and I've always struggled with it. And so it's like, whenever I see someone, whether in real life or in a fiction, who knows how to operate in those contexts, it's a fascination to me. It's like, what does it take? You know what I'm saying? How do you have to be wired to walk into a place like that and be like, okay, I know how to deal with this. And not only do I know how to deal with it, I know how to deal with it on the spot, in a moment of difficulty and tension and personal responsibility, all of which you bring to bear in this story for these characters. Jen is very implicated in the drama of the story, and it's just a fascination to me how power works.
I love that phrase. I remember hearing that in Chicago. Yeah, he really knows how to operate. Yeah.
So it's that, and then I think it's also how are we supposed to respond to the moral compromises that the quote-unquote real world sometimes requires us to make? And I think of that in particular with regard to Tim.
Yeah, that's
who
right.
is the CEO and who has to sort of serve as judge and jury over a lot of this stuff while also taking into consideration his own personal interests.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting moral framework.
Yeah, you put your finger on it. Because for me, the at the end, one of the big things was he makes there's a part I really like where he is trying to figure out if he should stand with this lower class woman and protect her. And he thinks of his own mother, who was very similar to her in terms of her, the difficulties in her life. And he resolves very grandly to help her. And we're like, oh, thank goodness, you know. And then the operator comes in and makes that kind of hard for him, and he capitulates. So that moment there was a draft somewhere where he makes everything nice, and the two women become friends. And it just, you know, so you think about endings like that could happen, you know, sure, it could happen. And I wrote it pretty well, but it just felt like a lower energy thing than the ending I used. And I think it was because, in a certain way, you get that first ending with this one. You can imagine a world where he actually makes good on his promises and protects the woman. So we're all thinking, yeah, that would be nice. And then the story has a chance to go one step further, which is what if he doesn't, you know? So that was it took me a while to figure that out. But in the end, he does what I think, you know, I have done stuff like that where you're at work and someone says, you know, did so-and-so fuck that up? And you're like, well, yeah, right. You know, I mean, you sort of have to, and then, you know, so, or so, and I've also done the other thing where I've just lied about it and then gotten in trouble for it. So it's, you know.
These are not easy questions. These kinds of things, I mean, they cause me such great anguish, you know, these sorts of human interactions and, you know, where underlying all of it is money, right? It's like your bread and butter and how you're going to survive. And so, you know, the decisions that people have to make in these circumstances are grueling, and they cost a lot. You know, they have a real human cost.
Yeah, and also that kind of consensus view that, well, you know, she has to be fired because blah blah blah, and then you think, oh, that's pretty harsh. You know, that you'd have a consensus view that sometimes allows you to be a killer, you know, and just cut somebody's livelihood off.
Right.
Yeah, and then also, you know, from those Russians, I think I got sort of sensitized to the idea that if you want to look for morality in a story, it can be really small, you know, like if, like in Love Letter, you know, if one guy has this extra cautious idea, you kind of understand it. Well, you multiply that times 5 million people, and you get like, for example, in Germany, you get the Holocaust. There was a wonderful Deborah Eisenberg quote about how it really just, evil on that scale just takes a bunch of people being quiet and a handful of people being loud. The quiet people they don't think they're making a referendum. They just think they're minding their own business, but cumulatively, you know. So in this story, this lady who probably should have gotten fired, she's a thief. All right. You know, she gets fired. We follow her home a little bit and you think, oh boy, that's rough. You know, multiply that times, you know, 20 million small decisions like that. And you get some explanation for why people feel alienated in a capitalist culture, because, you know, those little slices are happening all the time in everybody's life.
But yeah, by the way, you're also bringing to light the fact that stealing in maybe all of the world, but I'm thinking of American capitalist culture, it's as common as breathing. I mean, people are always like going on, you know, little boondoggles and swiping the company credit card and, you know, taking home a roll of paper towels. That stuff happens all the time. You wonder how much it costs every year. You know? Right.
Well, I wrote my first book at work, you know, and so
yeah, you're the poster child,
and I didn't hand over the royalties.
Yeah, right. So the next story is called Sparrow, which is such a sweet story, like an unlikely love story about a man with an overbearing mother, and they have like a family store. She, you know, the mother is the owner. She's kind of passing it along to her son, who now kind of runs it. And there is a woman who works there. Is this Gloria?
That's Gloria. Yeah.
Okay, that's Gloria. Okay, so Gloria works there, and she is this sweet, lonely, often misunderstood woman who, you know, like I was saying, works in the store. It's so funny the way you depict her, the way she's always kind of saying, exactly what you would expect someone to say. But she's lovable. I mean, you just absolutely love her, and it winds up being this really big-hearted, like, unlikely love story. And where did this one come from?
Well, this was that rare story that came out of a dream, which usually I don't, you dream something, you go, just stay in bed. It's, the dancing coat hanger story. Let's leave that one in the dream, But there was something. There was a first page or so, or first paragraph. It just came to me in a dream, and when I was lying in bed, I could kind of keep going. Like that feeling where you just hit a vein, like, oh God, I can do this voice. So I got up out of bed at about 3 a.m. and sat down on the kitchen table and just started typing without my glasses, so I can't really see, and somehow I just kept going. I felt like, well, still going. And so for me, the real point of origin was this. While I was doing that, I was going pretty well, and I got to a place where I typed the line, and of course there had to be a fall, because this sort of nondescript woman had fallen in love with this kind of macho, selfish guy, and then I just went, God, how boring, that I know the direction my own story is going in. That kind of auto darkness that I think a lot of fiction tends to go that way, because the stories kind of like it. But I just felt like, I don't know. So then I started just trying to work against my own narration a little bit. And I noticed in the preceding section there was kind of a collective community voice. We thought, and that narrator is kind of telling us what to think of this woman, a little derisively. But meanwhile, in my mind, there was something that kind of liked this woman, So I'm getting somebody talking in my ear saying, she's really not so great, but I'm not entirely trusting that person. So at that point, I started saying to the story, would you, let's discuss the possibility of another outcome. Can we do that, And I felt this real lightness of heart, like, oh, of course, that happens all the time, Totally strange. Two people get together. They're both have big defects, but they like the defects in one another, and that's a love story. That's every love story, actually. So it was kind of a fun thing, and it happened all before the sun came up, and then I, of course, rewrote it for months after that. But the basic core of it was there. But so I learned something, which is you can sometimes interrogate your own narration to find out where the story might want to go. The fact that I had put in these kind of snotty community narrators, that meant that I could pick a fight with them later and I could defy them, But when I sat down, it was just me talking. It was that dream voice in my head, Weird.
Well, I want to have you read a passage from this story, if you would, please, because it really, will give listeners a great idea of the sweet love story that you're telling here. And I think this passage is where the man and the woman, Gloria, and I'm going to forget the guy's name because I
forgot it too.
Is it Randy?
Randy, yeah, of course.
Yeah, Gloria and Randy. This passage depicts them as they really start to fall in love.
Yeah. So imagine you are a woman who all your life people have shied away from and avoided, and whenever you said something, it went out into the world and just hung there, causing a neutral or slightly adverse reaction. And every time this happened, you felt it. And so behind you in your life, there had accrued a series of light but painful little blows, conspiring to convince you that there was something wrong with you. And now you find yourself in the daily presence of a man who seems to be coming to like you, and has even started to leave you little presents on the break room table, a chocolate mint, a single Twinkie. And imagine that this man's mother is against it, against this thing that is the thing that now propels you, Gloria, out of bed every morning. And that she, the mother, finds all of this amazing and laughable and disappointing, and even one day tells her son that his interest in you is causing her to downgrade her opinion of him. And imagine that the man shares this with you. But far from discouraging him, he says, this has actually made him feel for the first time that he is the protector of some woman not his mother, which, he says, blushing, has made him feel tender toward you or whatnot. Imagine the kind of month that would be for you if you were that woman. And imagine you were that man who for the first time feels he is protecting a woman not his mother, a woman who is so much more full of life than his old, tan, bent but agile mother, whose smug eternal certainty is for the first time coming to seem tiresome, as are those big honker glasses that once belonged to his father, into which she, for some reason, put new lenses last year, that is, 11 whole years after your father's passing. That woman, that young, energetic woman with whom you often now find yourself in pleasant agreement, might suddenly start to seem even prettier to you, even if no one else seems to notice it. But you notice it, this uptick in her prettiness, and say so, in one of those notes you've begun leaving on the break table with those snacks, notes that are getting longer and longer lately and sometimes even border on the passionate, in which your grammar will sometimes go a bit off as you struggle to express these new feelings, and that might even include a drawing of, for example, a cartoon man with stars pouring out the open top of his head. And one day there comes a kiss in the stockroom. After it you say, "Not bad," to which she replies, "Not bad at all," which you take as confirmation that you are, as you have always felt yourself to be, an excellent kisser, and now someone has finally noticed it. Thank you very much.
So I just love that. And I want to say to all the guys out there listening that if you're into someone and you're trying to woo her, a single Twinkie is always an option.
It's so tasteful.
It really
if you give two, it's like too much.
Right. But the single, artfully placed and presented Twinkie, well lit, it could work wonders.
With a single bite taken out of it. That's a nice. It means right. I'm participating with you
in this sin. But it is a lovely story, and you're just rooting for Gloria, rooting for him too. With his overbearing mom, and I think some of the questions that it brought to mind is what is the power of love in this world? Because not only does it have this incredible impact on Gloria and Randy, but hopefully without spoiling too much, it also affects other characters in the book. It's interesting to me. I was reading this. I was thinking about the ways in which the people around two people who are in love can change based on the force of their interaction. Like, that's a real thing. You feel that at weddings. I mean, I know there are cynics out there, and not all relationships work out, but I am a sucker for a wedding because I think it's an optimistic human occasion. Like, I love a wedding because it's like, okay, we're rooting. Let's do this. Let's love each other. It always gets to me. And I feel it, and I also can observe it in the people around me. And it's also noticeable outside the context of a wedding, just when you're in a room with two people who are really in sync.
Yeah.
So it made me think about that. And then it also made me think about what it truly means to be seen. Because Gloria is a woman who all her life has been struggling with this. No one ever sees her. And maybe in some ways she doesn't see herself, but then Randy sees her. Yeah. And that changes everything.
Yeah, and what I liked about it as it came out was that he sees her. He doesn't really see her. He sees her in its own context. He likes her because in fact, because she doesn't really have a lot of opinions, she just agrees with his, which he takes as sanction. Oh, she's so insightful, But I think that's the way it works, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're always doing sort of, love is kind of like attentive compensation. But I also loved your first idea about, when I was writing that Lincoln book, that's something I noticed was that this idea of like viral goodness. If you see a person do a selfless thing, it changes you. And, so I like that because it means, it's a really good rationale for trying to do good things. It's not just, okay, the good thing itself, and maybe you're right about it being a good thing, maybe you're not. But if your intention is good, it actually does make a little cloud of positivity around you or engagement or activity. And I think especially in, as we're saying all these times like these, I don't think we should underrate the power of the incremental. You do, in one exchange with somebody, you're trying to stay positive. That has an effect. And if in one exchange with somebody, you're being nasty as shit and you're being aggressive or whatever, that has an effect. So maybe, when I start feeling kind of powerless, which this particular era is making me feel, I just kind of go back to that, like, well, you can only control the stuff at arm's length, really. So do that. Try to be, positive in your own surroundings, and hopefully it'll link up with somebody else's.
And for the listener, when George referred to that Lincoln book that he wrote, he's referring to Lincoln and the Bardo. Booker Prize winning Lincoln and the Bardo. So I just want to make sure people
that Lincoln book,
that Lincoln book, just that prize winning Lincoln book that was a big bestseller.
That piece of crap.
Yeah, right. But the next story is called Ghoul, and it is, I think, it shares a kind of kinship with Liberation Day. It's another one of these stories that feels speculative and a little bit sci-fi. It is narrated by a character named Brian, and it takes place in a subterranean amusement park. I believe, is it called the Maws of Hell? Is that what it's called?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Right.
I have to talk to the marketing department about that, but that is yes, it is called the Maws of Hell.
And the employees, I think, one of the big things for listeners to understand about this story is that within this realm, this subterranean amusement park called the Maws of Hell, employees are punished brutally for the slightest infraction. And they are waiting for visitors who increasingly, it seems, might never show up. But that's my thumbnail. This is another one of those stories where I'm like, wow, where did this start for George? It seems like you, what were you at an amusement park? Were you at Disney World? What happened?
No, it's just, for me, it's all, often the answer to your question is voice. So for this one, I had read the audiobook of CivilWarLand, my first book, and I had never read it aloud, the whole thing before ever. And I just was like, oh, that's actually, that voice is still speaking to me. I can still do it. And I can see by reading it that it's pretty weird voice, but it can get you into places that are unusual, So I just came home and thought, I'm going to try to just reactivate that voice and see if I can still do it. And it was Halloween, I think, it was autumn. So I'm like, okay, I guess sort of thinking about those haunted houses that you built as a kid, in your garage or whatever. But again, like with Liberation Day, it just starts off as a riff. You start doing a certain voice. And for me also, I can't do an infinite number of voices. So it's almost like there are 7 or 8 boxes. And this one, I'm like, okay, so that story, John, that I wrote years ago, that's kind of like this. Liberation Day has got it's kind of like, kind of an optimistic, lovable moron, there's just this, I don't know, the box has that label on it, optimistic, lovable moron, used infrequently. But so then you just start doing that voice, and in the fun of it and the kind of comedy of it, the person will blurt out something that you can use to make plot. They tell you what their job is, or they tell you what their usual day is like. So that's where, for me, that's where kind of the leaping is involved. I don't really at that point know that it will be a story. I'm trying to not figure out how it could be a story. I'm just trying to sustain that voice, usually for 2 or 3 pages, and then I'll cut it back. I'll say, okay, well, that's too much. Let me come back to this section here. And that will give me both a crazy voice, but a fairly realistic spine of action, like something's happening that day. And, and so for me, the fun is the not knowing. I know it's kind of funny so far. Page 1 is pretty funny. It also, there's a kind of audacity in it where you're like, the reader suspects that you're just messing around, having fun, and you are. And then you both know that there's an obligation on the table, which is that this thing is supposed to rise to the level of an actual story and be about something important in spite of its silliness, So that's kind of just a mutual, like a dare sort of, So, yeah.
And you have, I think the thing about it, as a reader and as a writer, that I kind of marvel at is like bridging that divide, like pulling off the magic trick and making it believable. And as fun as it is, and as silly or audacious as it can be, there's also a real edge to it that often comes into play in your stories. There's a lot of menace in Ghoul, and you start to move through the story as a reader, and kind of the smile disappears from your face a little bit. You're like, oh, geez, what is this?
I think that, for me, the trick is you have to, every day, you have to get up trying to believe in that reality. So, and which means in a certain way, stop believing in your themes, but look at what does the floor look like and what's his daily routine. And even though it's a really far-fetched concept, you have to believe in it. Because of course, if you think about, imagine you're Ben Franklin, and then someone describes a typical day in the life of a United States office worker. That's sci-fi. I mean, it's what? A copier. What's a copier? What's that machine makes coffee, like that. So everything is far-fetched, actually, depending on where you are. So for me, with this, I'm like, well, it does seem to me far-fetched, but it doesn't seem far-fetched to him because he lives there, Then you sort of do that self-hypnosis of saying, I accept everything about this world as being just as realistic as my most realistic story. Let me provide the same amount of detail. And then what I'm waiting for, especially in that story, was, okay, when are you going to start speaking to my reader where she is right now in 2022? It can't just be a romp. It has to be, I'm always looking for a romp with a little bit of meaning, or relevance. So then you're just kind of cooking it. You sort of cooking this soup until suddenly it says, oh, I'm a story now, and I will be speaking to a reader who is in Cleveland in 2022 living her life, and that's the really hard part, And
I think thematically or at the level of big question, this is a story that, again, like prior stories we've discussed, called to mind for me, what you have to do and who you have to be to succeed in a capitalist society or a corrupt system. And then this one, Ghoul, I think, really brought to bear this question of, is it worth surviving in a brutal and corrupt system by becoming complicit with it, which is sort of like Love Letter. It's that question of wow, where's the line for me? That's what it was causing me to ask myself. Where's the line for me? And I think Brian, the narrator of this story, this is about him in the process of discovering maybe that line. Yeah,
and it takes a lot for him to get pushed over because he's so habituated to that world. This really brutal world is the only one he knows. So for him, it's not. I guess that was another thing in this book was this idea that, given how much things have changed in the last 5 years, I've really been amazed to look at my previous self and go, oh boy, that guy was so complacent. He really thought this was all solid, and then when it all changes, it takes a while for your belief system to catch up. You're sort of trapped in the disbelief that your previous system was wrong. So I think he's kind of like that a little bit. And then also there was something just at the 11th hour, I started picking up on something about something a little more existential because, they've been told certain truths their whole lives. And it's a salvation myth, the visitors are coming and it's going to make all this worthwhile. And so somehow with that, once I got the title Liberation Day for the book in mind, I thought, oh yeah, it's interesting. We're always, in every moment, I'm always waiting for life to stop hurting, for life to start being easy and triumphant,
Right.
And that a lot of good things come out of that desire, but also it's funny at 63 to go, oh yeah, it's not going to. That is life. That feeling that sort of suffering or ambiguity or whatever you want to call it. That's it. That's when that stops, you're dead, which somehow I feel like I'm starting to get some kind of feeling of being reconciled to that a bit. Every time it seems to me that life is hurting too much, that's related to myself being too confident, so something like that. But that only at the very end of the story, I was like, oh yeah, of course they've been promised this their whole life, and now he sees that there's not going to be relief of that kind. Now what do you do?
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to try to pick it up here. We have a couple more stories to do. Are you good to go through them, or do you want to just do one?
We'll do multiple choice.
Yeah,
I'm totally fine.
Okay, yeah. Lightning round. We'll do lightning round here. The next story is called Mother's Day.
Man, I'm glad I didn't make a 20-story book. We'd be here till 8 o'clock.
This is, what is it? Best laid plans. You know what I'm saying? I had this
it's a great
vision.
idea. I'm loving it. I'm loving it.
So we're in Mother's Day, and I love this story. The interiority of this story really got to me. The way that so much of the drama plays out inside of the minds and memories of these two women. Who both love the same man and who have an existential reckoning in a hailstorm, if that's a way of putting it.
Yeah,
just a wonderful story, unexpected, so many good twists and vivid characters, creative point of origin. Is there one you can point to?
Well, I think what I would say about this one is it started way back during the time I was writing 10th of December. I had a version of it then. and it was way off. It was based on a woman that we knew when our kids were little in this little town in upstate, who was she'd walk around town very elegant. She had a pearl necklace, looked very good, and then the word got out that she was a hoarder. And there was something, she had a very old Victorian house, but the front porch was missing. It was just gone, you know. And then the story was that at one point her son took her out to lunch, or maybe her daughter did, for a really long lunch so that the city could get in and take all of her stuff out. And she was heartbroken. And, you know, so it started off to be that story about this woman who was a hoarder, basically. And I wrote that for years and years, sent it to the New Yorker, got rejected. And I just somehow wasn't going, you know. And so what I often do in that case is I just will add a second character. Just put the second character in there and see why she's in there. And in this case, it turned out that they both loved this woman's husband. And so, but it was a really long, crazy process. So that was just it. And we just, you know, going back to it again and again and going, I know there's something in here. I love her voice. Let me just keep poking at it to see how this long monologue can start to resemble a story, you know. But for me, that's the iteration, you know, over and over and over.
Well, but it's interesting that you stuck with it. Is this the exception rather than the rule with you? Or is it like, I can imagine you send a story off, it gets rejected, or you're struggling with it for such a long time that eventually you just say, you know what, this one's not meant to be. But the distinguishing factor here is that you just love the voice. It just,
yeah. And I try to never say it. I really try to just say, okay, you're just not seeing it yet. If the thing has power, you know, so the first couple of pages of this were in that old version, I would say. And I just liked her. I know that's got to be in a story somewhere. So I just haven't found the path yet, you know. So my kind of default is don't ever give up. Although I have one now that I may give up on. I somehow I can't for the first time in a long time. But yeah, I just feel like, you know, you know what I think is if I can get a paragraph that really is funny or is vivid or whatever, that I consider that a real precious gift, and I don't want to discard it. I just going to keep it and just try to find the right story to surround it, basically, you know.
So we'll move to Elliot Spencer, which again is, I would put this in sort of like the same DNA pool with Liberation Day and Ghoul. Elliot Spencer is about an elderly homeless man who has been reprogrammed as a kind of crisis actor in political contexts or protests. He's kind of a pawn, you know. He's kind of this guy who lived under a bridge, and he's been taken by some nefarious organization and reprogrammed to, you know, and bent to their whims, basically. This feels like maybe also in an, you know, kind of an oblong way, like a kindred spirit to love letter, you know, something that was born of kind of political concern and a contemporary sense.
Actually, it was the Liberation Day in that it was voice. I just was just thinking about sort of like, I guess, in some Buddhist way, thinking, okay, so I know that for me, like rumination is my enemy. A conscious conceptual thought is my enemy, because that's the thing that actually builds up the self, they say. You know, like, I'm having a great day. I wrote a book. I'm George, blah, blah, blah. So I was thinking about that, and I thought, well, is the goal then to have no thoughts at all? Which sometimes is, meditators talk about that, and I think it's not actually. But anyway, I thought, what it would be like if someone could just take away all this detritus in my mind that I mistake for myself, all my memories, all my habitual ways of thinking about things, my belief system, just take it all away, leave the operating system in place, and then put that thing in the world and see what happens. Does the operating system have pre-inclinations that would make me myself again? Or shorn of all that, is it just, you know, who knows? So so that just reduced to, okay, well, I don't know about that, but what would he sound like? So he's got no language. Well, that sounds like a blank page. Okay, he's got no language, but somebody's teaching him. And that became the beginning of the story. And so for me, the fascination is to say, okay, let's just try to come up with a charming, funny voice for that guy. And that's all I'm doing for the first couple of weeks. I'm just trying to come up with like a way that he can sound, and trying to keep at bay any thoughts of theme or anything. See if I can perfect his voice. And then eventually that starts telling you who he is. You know, so it starts telling you which questions to ask of him. You know, why are you talking like that? Where are you? You know, So then only later did it become kind of had a sort of political feeling to it, but that was late. And I also tried to keep it out a little bit. I tried to keep it a little bit unclear who's got him, who did this to him.
Yeah, that's like this story in particular, like, it's that process of discovery for the reader, and that sort of like creeping sense of menace that gives it its power, as you're kind of learning how to read it and figuring out what the heck's going on,
Yeah, for me, I think it's hard to talk about this part of it, but so much of the work that I'm doing is just trying to do like a sustained musicality. Like, I started the voice this way. Hopefully you kind of got it. Then I have to keep that same sound going, and even I have to escalate that sound. I have to make him, in this case, a little more articulate by the end. That takes a lot of energy just to do that, just to think of it musically. And so what I'm doing a lot is just arranging the prose so that you won't balk when you hit it. I'm training you to hear that voice. Okay. Then I fuck it up and you go, that's George. He just dropped the ball. That's not Elliot. It's George. Then that can't be. So it's a lot of sound stuff, actually. We tend to talk about stories in terms of meaning and theme and all that, which is totally correct. But en route, and I think even in our enjoyment of a story, it's the musicality that we're actually responding to. If you take a good writer and a not so good writer, tell them to write the same theme or the same story, it's actually going to be in the sound of the stuff that the good writer pulls ahead. And we're going to keep reading because of the sound and the rhythm and whatever else you call that makes us keep going. So I in talking about this with you like this, it's really interesting because my answer just keeps being voice,
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, it's like, it's really,
which I didn't
really
actually realize until today. So thank you.
Well, no, but it's like, I think for people who read this collection and who read these, more speculative, and I mean, Elliot Spencer, like on the page, the language is formally inventive, like some of the spacing and the way that the syntax is and all this stuff, the capitalization, so much of it is tied to sound. So much of it, I can imagine, had to require a ton of trial and error in the editing process to make sure that you weren't losing people, because you're asking the reader to sort of sing along with this music, that is very new and particular. But right. I think that it could be easy to misapprehend the way that you're building them. Yeah. Because it's like, wow, this is such a artfully and like, it's such a sound construction. George must really have this big picture view going into it of what it's going to look like. He must be like an architect drawing the blueprint. And the truth is that you're like, no, it's really just the sound of it to begin with. Yeah. And all that other stuff follows the music of that voice. Yeah. For me, it follows with the repetition. You go through it again and again and again, doing exactly the kind of adjustments you're suggesting. So I think sometimes of, actual music, like that song Tangled Up in Blue, I love that song. And if you talk about it, it tells a story of a man who lived a roaming lifestyle, or whatever. But it's actually the weird, the rhythms and the way that guitar is, and it's stuff that you can't even articulate that compels you through it. And if you said to somebody not Dylan, write a song about a guy with a rambling lifestyle, you wouldn't get that. So that's the pisser, is that that's hard. It's not really formulaic and so that's why it's endlessly fascinating, because you just can't reduce it really. I'm now having a memory of reading like some Dylan biography or something about Dylan where he was talking about that song and how long it took him to write. It makes some sense. It's a long song, period. Yeah. A lot of his songs run long, but it's it maybe to a degree that distinguishes it. It has like a narrative responsibility that might add a layer. Yeah. But also every one of those lines is so you don't really see it coming from the line before, and that's a real trick. Yeah. She was married when we first met, soon to be divorced. That's right. Right. I helped her out of a jam, I guess, but I used a little too much force. That's pretty good. So last story is called My House, and it is about a man who tries to buy a house, like a beautiful old historic kind of house, from a man who has lived there for a long time and whose wife is sick. And the guy who owns the house currently with the sick wife is very particular about this house. He loves it. He's just lived in it forever. It's really got all of his memories in it. And, it speaks to the way that we can imbue objects with so much meaning. Home especially, I think, carries a lot of meaning for people if they've been there a long time. And there's this great twist in the story, and I hope it's okay for me to talk about it, where, this guy wants to buy the house, and he knows he's got to sort of charm this guy. And he really is charmed by the fact that this guy loves the house so much. And so he sort of resigned himself to pay the asking price. And then as he's having a conversation with this guy, there's this wonderful twist where the current owner says, and hey, would you mind, like, after you buy it, if I could maybe come back and stay a few days every year? Like, I could imagine you as the writer getting to that moment and having that come to be, and suddenly just being like, there we go. Like, was that the linchpin of the story? Like, is that what made it all click?
It was. And here I'm going to contradict my complete shtick manual and say, what happened was there was a house like that in Cherry Valley, New York. We rented a house during the pandemic there, and there was a house on a hill that was just like the one described. Beautiful, big, yellow, probably built in the early 1800s maybe. And it just got my imagination. Oh God, I could die happily there, but okay, we're not going to buy it. So, then, David Mamet talks about how writing a story is very much like, those moments of involuntary fantasy that we have. Like where you think about what you should have said back in high school, or when you imagine getting revenge on your enemy, in a way that you didn't do it. Just in your mind, you suddenly go, oh, wow, I just imagined that I'm a senator and I just made a big speech about whatever. So you didn't decide to do it. Your mind just went there. And he says that some really great storytelling comes out of that mode, where your natural curiosity and your natural, whatever it is, pride or desire, is just manifesting itself in fantasy. So one day I was driving around thinking about that house, and my imagination, my little fantasy, just went there somehow. Like, if I could buy that house, and then somehow that little twist just popped into literally just popped into my head, of somebody saying, I want to give you this house. However, I'm sure you won't mind if. And in the story, what I did discover when I was writing was just that the guy, our hero, he just hesitates. He doesn't really say no, but he's just kind of like, whoa, and the other guy is in a particular place where that's enough to derail the whole deal for him, And so sometimes like that vignette popped into my head, and I just thought, oh, that is so human. That is just us, isn't it?
It's like Seinfeld. I was going to say Seinfeldian. It's kind of like this Seinfeldian twist, that really is funny. And just those and like you say, he doesn't say no. He's not like a dick about it. He just pauses. Right. And in that pause, everything can unravel in a human exchange. And I think that's very true to life. And I certainly recognize it in my own experience and my own foibles. But it's a lovely story. I read a review of the book as I was prepping that pointed to that story as an allegory for climate change. I don't know if that was on your brain at all, but I was kind of like, wow, that's an interesting angle on that one. Like the disintegration of our home. I think maybe everybody's got climate on their mind these days, so you're always sort of tuned for it. But
that's interesting. Because after this happens, the guy who should have sold the house, he's so stubborn, and now he's so broke that the house just kind of falls apart, and nobody gets it.
And nobody gets it. Yeah. Well, it's a lovely story, and it's a fitting end to the collection. And I am grateful for you for letting this run a little bit long. We got to complete the cycle and kind of take listeners on a full tour of your new book, which is just wonderful. And the way that I like to end my conversations is by asking if you're working on anything new. No pressure if you're just enjoying this one, but is there something in the works?
I took a break from fiction just because I sometimes feel like the well has to fill up a little bit. But since I'm not doing at this moment, not working, but for the last 3 or 4 months, I was working on a TV pilot for what we mentioned earlier, CivilWarLand. It's kind of come back alive again, nice. And I'm working with this wonderful writer named Alison Silverman, and so we're just kind of coming back to that material, and it's really been fun. It's for a different medium, and we've got the idea of doing stop motion animation with this wonderful director named Duke Johnson, who did Anomalisa. So we're kind of perfecting that a little bit, and it's kind of exciting,
And you're getting used to your new environs in Los Angeles.
Yeah. Just we have a beautiful dog, and she's loving it. We take her around the block once a day, past the cool coffee shops, and it's very, it's a nice.
What kind of dog
life.
You got?
Oh, we got a yellow lab named Gwen, and she's 10, and she's just a dear heart, and yeah.
She get in the ocean?
Oh yeah, well she does, but she had a knee problem, so whenever she goes to the beach, she kind of aggravates that. So it's pretty few and far between. She loves it, but she gets excited and then she hurts her knee again. So.
Got it. Well, welcome to town. I am so appreciative, of you with your generosity of time. Congratulations on the new book. It's great to see you again. And
yeah, you
I wish
too.
you
And
well.
thank you for guiding us through that. That was really fun. I learned some things about my book.
Well, good to see you, George.
Thank you so much.